All right, let's start with our top story, which is in Ukraine. So if you happen to be an Al Qaeda or ISIS terrorist, chances are you're not watching our show. Hopefully you're not watching our show. Well, if you happen to be, then NATO and Ukraine want you to come fight in Ukraine, and they'll pay you handsomely for it. We already knew this was happening, but in recent weeks it has actually accelerated because Ukrainian forces have been nearly decimated and wiped away, almost entirely eliminated from the battlefield. I spoke to Colonel Douglas McGregor last night, who says the forces are almost gone. Listen.
As you point out, most of Ukrainians' best forces are gone. They've been killed or wounded. Ukrainians have lost roughly 100,000 dead, perhaps 2, 3, even 400,000 wounded.
Wow.
They started out with an army of 600,000. Remember, we spent 8 years building this army up with the express purpose of attacking Russia. That's what it was designed to do. That's why the Russians attacked it.
So, I couldn't help but thinking, and some people in the chat are saying this, like Uncle Sam wants you to join us in war. And that's like what I'm thinking when I picture basically the recruitment now for Al Qaeda and ISIS terrorists in Ukraine. Like, NATO wants you. They want your support, terrorists, to come and fight in Ukraine. So, of course, they need fighters who can become cannon fodder, as Colonel McGregor was telling us last night. And so, in March of this year, the Cradle reported that Al Qaeda and ISIS fighters were arriving by the busloads into Ukraine from northern Syria and passing through Turkey. Now, NATO has been paying these Al Qaeda and ISIS fighters a few $1,000s a month. Just let that sink in for a moment. NATO has been paying these Al Qaeda and ISIS fighters a few $1,000s a month.
Okay.
So, it probably warrants more than that kind of a response, don't you think? Think about this. As American taxpayers or European taxpayers, you are funding terrorists to go into Ukraine.
The same organizations that we funded wars to kick them out of places.
Right. Or that we lay claim to, we're fighting ISIS in these particular countries. That's why we need to be in Syria. Or that's why we need to be in Afghanistan. Or that's why we need to be in Iraq or have some kind of a presence. So you can't pay your heating bills right now, or your rent, but your tax dollars are going to fund Al Qaeda and ISIS fighters in Ukraine. Now, this is an ISIS fighter who was captured just recently. He's interrogated, explains how he's been paid by Ukraine and NATO to fight Russia. Watch.
دا چې د خارجي کشورونو چې خلک راتل دا میرا وستل او خارجي کشورونو مرسته راټولولې د داعش ډلې لپاره چې د آلمان نه اوکراین او سپین نه دا مرسته راټولولې او د کم کسان ته دعوت هم کول سونه 15 کسان ته تقریبا ما دعوت کړې دا غي څخه یو کس افغانستان ته راغلی دا کوم مرسته چې ما راټولې کړې د اوکراین نه $15,000 $15,000 یورو د آلمان نه او 600 او 800 روپۍ 1500 ټول راځي تقریبا د سپین یورو.
How does that sit with you? How does that sit with anybody watching the show right now?
Terrifying and also sad.
If you've been watching our show for any length of time, you know that we've been covering the U.S. occupation of Syria, of course, on this show. And in Syria, the United States has been funding Al Qaeda forces to fight against the government of Bashar al-Assad. According to the Cradle, of course, most of these terrorists showing up in Ukraine are veterans of the U.S.-backed proxy war in Syria. So they are hardened, they're trained, they're veterans. The Al Qaeda and ISIS terrorists coming from Syria specifically into Ukraine are being paid between $1,200 and $1,500 per month. Of course, everyone with a brain, all of you watching right now, because you do have a brain, unless you're watching the Western mainstream media, but of course, everyone with a brain knows the United States created Al Qaeda. And if you're a woke liberal who thinks that this sounds like some sort of a conspiracy theory, then you simply don't know your history, and you need to. Watch this.
Brzezinski was the strategist for Jimmy Carter and convinced Jimmy Carter to say, look, the Russians are dominating Afghanistan with a civilian secular government. Let's create a new organization. Let's create Al Qaeda. Let's back Osama bin Laden and give his supporters weapons to begin fighting the Russians. And we can pull a coup d'etat there. And the Russians will fight back, and then we'll say the Russians invaded. And it worked. Saudi Arabia made a deal with America that they would push the Wahhabi extremists, the Al Qaeda, the most right-wing wing of the Islamic parties, and it worked. Essentially, Al Qaeda is a contract army for the United States.
Al Qaeda is a contract army for the United States. Think about that for a minute. When you need fighters and you need to stir up some crap and you need to attack Bashar al-Assad's government, or you need fighters in Ukraine because the Ukrainian forces have been all but decimated and eliminated, who do you need as cannon fodder? Who do you need to stir up some trouble and we'll pay them a few $1,000s a month? Call in Al Qaeda.
Yeah.
Call in ISIS.
What I used to get so, I used to watch the video footage coming from Afghanistan and all these other places, and anytime they showed ISIS, anytime they showed Al Qaeda, they always had the tan U.S. military boots and stuff on, the pants of American soldiers, and I was always like, where are they getting? Why are they wearing U.S. clothing and driving U.S. vehicles? And it's because we've probably been working with them all along.
I was reading a book called The Hidden Hand of American Hegemony about the deals that the United States made in the 70s with Saudi Arabia in order to create OPEC, in order to create petrodollar recycling, and in order to allow the United States to be able to print money to pay for goods all around the world, because it meant that petrol was paid for in the American dollar, and it gave the United States hegemony. And because of that, deals with Saudi Arabia were mostly made under the table, so much so that the head of the Treasury Department had a secret wire in the 70s between his office and the head of the CIA, because that's how money and government were working together.
A secret wire account.
I'm sorry, the technology. It's like a wire, like a secret phone line.
Oh, phone line. Okay, I thought you meant they could just send money.
Oh, no.
Like a wiring account.
A secret communication channel.
Yeah.
Because they couldn't rely on messengers and things. They needed immediate communication between the head of the CIA and the head of the Treasury Department.
Wow.
And OPEC funds that came from Saudi Arabia were classified and still are.
We're all being played, people. I mean, this is the thing. You just flip open your Washington Post, or you open your Atlantic magazine or whatever, and you just go on with your day, or you open your Google News or Apple News and you get your basic headlines, the stuff that they're spoon feeding you. And the real stories are in the books, are hidden in the texts.
Yes.
They are, and we are being played. We're being played like fiddles right now. And that's why, so when we go through this research and we spend the time, we want you to share this content. We want you to subscribe. We want you to push this out to other people, because people need to see what is happening and how this hegemony is run, how these imperial powers are run. And they're run on the backs of ignorance. Because if you have a mass of people that simply don't know or don't care, then you're able to get away with this crap. You really are. And you can see it in COVID. You can see it in all of these world. We're going to cover tomorrow on the show more deeply now the United States moving ships into Haiti and canceling visas and moving forward with an invasion of Haiti. We need to know these things. You're not going to see it other places.
Yeah. And this whole story, it smacks of, I hate to say it, but racism. It's let's pull in some brown people so that, we can use them in the front lines.
And we heard that at the beginning of the war, right? Why are we focused so much on Ukraine? And why are people putting up Ukrainian flags all over the world and showing their support? Where's
your Somali flags? Where's your Ethiopia flags?
Where's your
Yemen flags?
Exactly.
Right.
Where is all of that?
Well, and that's the thing, never, do you remember a time when we went into Iraq or everything and we were go there to help the people? We didn't put up Iraqi flags on our profiles. This is a new phenomenon. This is something we've just started doing.
Yeah, good point. And in the grocery store, this lady was like, would you like to spend extra to donate to Ukraine? And I was like, do you also have a fund for Syria? And she was like, no. And I was like, oh, okay, I'd like to give to all of them if that's okay.
Yeah.
Poor lady in the grocery store.
I got up really upset. I support Russia too, that kind of thing. Because it's people don't understand that there are people on both sides. And I reached out to a company that really irritated me that made their, like, in their terms of service, they said, we're not going to sell our app to Russian people. And I was like, why would you put what the government does on the people? It's not their fault. It's not like the people were like, hey, let's go do this. You know, so it's like, right. I see, it just upsets me to no end when people are celebrating Starbucks pulling out of Russia and all these companies pulling out of Russia. It's just virtue signaling, first of all. And second of all, it only hurts real people like us.
Yeah.
No, it's always
in Europe, a lot of Russians have turned into targets. So if you have, let's say, a license plate from Belarus, or, you know, anything that shows that you might have come from Russia, then people assume that you are unbanked because banks won't work with you. And that makes people targeted to take whatever cash these families are escaping from. It's really terrifying. This is not what, I don't think most people who want to put a Ukraine flag on their avatar signed up for this. No, they were supporting people and citizens, and I understand that. Meanwhile, you know, being president, Vladimir Zelensky, while he's been president, he's been repeatedly calling for, so if we go back to this Iraq part of the story, been repeatedly calling for foreign mercenaries to come and fight in Ukraine. We've been covering this story for a number of months. Zelensky put out the call, and NATO picks up the tab. Seems like a pretty good relationship, right? Like, we want these people, and who's going to foot the bill for them to come here and live, and we're going to pay them a stipend to fight on our behalf? NATO, you guys will all pick up the tab on that. In recent weeks, Al Qaeda has been publicly, by the way, sharing the number of Russian dead on their social media pages. Daniel Drumbill tweeting this earlier. By the way, isn't it amazing? So here's, again, these are Al Qaeda sharing on their social media. Isn't it amazing that top level doctors like speak out about problems with COVID on social media, and they have their accounts blocked and banned, and yet Al Qaeda is allowed to publicly talk about Russians they're targeting in Ukraine? Like, Twitter, where are your standards? Can I see your terms of service, Twitter, like where that's okay? We will allow Al Qaeda to keep their accounts and post that. But when when the Florida Surgeon General speaks out about myocarditis, we got to block him and ban his account. That is outrageous.
But these accounts are on Twitter. Like, you can literally see them. President Biden last night, not to be outdone, gave a really... Well, I have a couple of feelings about this interview that he did with CNN. It was clearly, if you know anything about television, and we do, I've spent 20 years in television, you can clearly tell when something has been edited. So when Jake Tapper asks him a question, and then President Biden gives a fairly succinct answer, and then they cut the video and they cut back to Jake for his next question, it's clearly been edited. So that was throughout the interview, and a couple of times they let him sort of ramble on with answers. Well, last night, CNN... I mean, this moment really stood out to me. Jake Tapper repeated the Western propaganda. Like, he is full on in the tank for the Western propaganda about Putin being isolated and crazy and going crazy, out of his mind. Watch this.
So French President Macron told me that he doesn't think that Putin is acting rationally. And he said that he thinks a lot of this is because of how isolated Putin was for 2 years during the pandemic. And others who have dealt with him, Condi Rice and Bob Gates and James Clapper, have used words like erratic and unhinged to describe Putin's behavior today. Do you think Putin is a rational actor?
I think he is a rational actor who's miscalculated significantly. I think he thought, you may recall, I pointed out that they were going to invade, that all those 100,000 or more troops there, and no one believed that he was going to invade Ukraine. You listen to what he says. If you listen to the speech he made after, when that decision was being made, he talked about the whole idea of he was needed to be the leader of Russia that united all the Russian speakers. I mean, I just think it's irrational.
Does that sound irrational? That he needs to be a leader that will unite Russians? That's wacky.
That's crazy talk.
That's crazy talk.
I mean, I thought that's what we were all about. Kamala Harris is like, no, this is all about our values. Like, we're uniting people over our values. Isn't that the exact same thing?
He's irrational. That's totally crazy.
I had not heard this. Putin just was sad during COVID isolation, so he needed to start a war.
Like, yeah, so Putin for 2 years.
I was kind of bored. Like, some people took up knitting or rowing. you know?
And
Could you see the infomercial?
Horseback riding topless. So.
I could see the infomercial.
Horseback riding topless. So.
I could see the infomercial now. You know, Putin. During COVID, some people took up knitting and crocheting, but Vladimir Putin took up war. And this is the story about how 2 years of
this is how he spent his
isolation.
Lockdown, as if he didn't have things to do.
He ate enough goulash that finally sent him over the edge. Enough vodka and goulash.
Two
One
countries.
Man.
Okay, that's weird.
A pandemic. Like, it's the craziest crap in the world. This idea that, and I've featured in other videos where it's like Mad Vlad and he's hidden in a bunker and he's isolated and all of these things. There's zero evidence of that at all. Show it to me. Please share that. We'd love to see it. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. But of course, the Western media and Jake Tapper just going along with this propaganda. So a few weeks ago, we saw a lot of Western propaganda saying that young men in Russia were running for the border so as to avoid the military draft. We saw all of that. The Western media was lying to you. We got new numbers out today, actually, and it shows that those recruitment centers in Russia have actually seen a 70,000 volunteer army show up. So young men in Russia, 70,000 of them
Oh my goodness.
have shown up for recruitment. And the recruitment centers have been incredibly busy. Of course, the Western media was saying that there was a draft and they were conscripting people and people were running for the border and they were trying to get out. And I'm sure you can always find one or two, you can always find like an anecdotal story, but the overwhelming numbers now are 70,000. And that is in addition to the 300,000, which was not a draft, which was in fact active military who were called up for this mission. So again, more Western propaganda that no matter where you come down on this war, like that's just propaganda. So we try to cut through that crap here on the show. There are about 3 weeks until, though, the ground freezes in Ukraine and Russian forces start mobilizing. And of course, we spoke to Colonel McGregor last night, who said that's when this real war will begin. It's too muddy right now, but once that ground freezes, so this would be a perfect time for peace, wouldn't it? Like, you've got like a 3-week window here where all hell is about to break loose. So now is a good time for peace. While the ground is still soft, it's not frozen yet.
We're heading into Christmas.
Yeah, maybe now is a time. Now is a time to talk peace. And instead, so earlier today, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said again today that they are open for peace talks. But what did they get in response? They got attacks from NATO. So here's an attack. Instead of peace talks, NATO launched missiles inside of Russia, hitting electrical substations, knocking out power to thousands of people. Again, this is inside of Russia. Okay, this is inside of Russia. This is not Ukraine. It's in Belgrade region. So NATO, instead of working towards peace, is now ramping up weapons shipments and attacks.
Well, I loved the headlines too around Sergei Lavrov, says we continue to be open to peace, but Western leaders say that rings hollow. Well, how do you know if you're not going to try?
Yes, great point.
So do you think that they're going to ghost you like a blind date? That they're just not going to show up? Because isn't it worth somebody's life to try?
Just talk?
Like what kind of news editor runs that headline? If there's any chance, right, that like you can hold someone's feet to the fire and say, go, just try for peace. But you are a news editor and you go with that headline saying Westerners say that rings hollow, when there's any chance that what you could do could promote peace.
Yeah, someone was asking in the chat, when was that attack? Sorry. Someone was asking in the chat, when was this attack? This attack on that electrical substation was early this morning. So go ahead, David.
I was going to say, think about the narrative that they could get. Like, we actually attempted at peace and Putin did not accept. Therefore, you could get people more behind your cause because, hey, at least you tried peace first. But in this instance, it's like they know that Putin would go for peace, so they can't even propose that.
Isn't it funny,
it's
though?
It's a stupid thing to say. It rings hollow.
To all of you, everyone watching right now, you guys, think about the times when you've been like in a fight with somebody, right? And you're like, it's like a quiet Cold War where you're not talking to the person, right? You're just not having a conversation. They don't want to talk to you. And it's just like, you know how it is, right? It's brothers, sisters, husbands, wives, brothers. It doesn't matter, right? Everyone has been in that kind of a fight. And isn't it, I would say almost universally, isn't it almost always better when you have a conversation with someone to sort out the problem? I just always find that to be the case.
Yeah.
I've never had it where I get you can have you can stonewall someone and it's like, oh, we walked out of there worse than we were before. I get it. That happens.
Look at Kennedy and Gorbachev, right? Or
Khrushchev. Yeah.
Khrushchev, I mean, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, when
they had a conversation.
They have a conversation. Just have a conversation. And maybe I'm wrong. Like, I'm sure someone in the chat's going to be like, no, not with my ex-wife. That's not the case. Like, I get it. But I would say 99% of the time, having a conversation with someone likely results in progress in some capacity.
And this rings hollow argument is just more of like, we know what's in Vladimir Putin's soul kind of thing, when we really don't have to guess all that much, because he continues to say, we're going to do this, and then those things happen. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of guesswork here, but we continue to sort of play armchair psychologist around Vladimir Putin when there is here an open opportunity to talk of peace. Now, he also has said, if there are attacks inside of our borders, this is game on in a more dangerous way. So we just saw an escalation of exactly what he said he better not see.
So according to Foreign Policy Magazine, how many of you read Foreign Policy Magazine, which is just a mouthpiece of the deep state and the military-industrial complex? But Washington reads it and sort of guides their principles by it. Says NATO isn't doing enough to increase the war in Ukraine. This is Foreign Policy Magazine, quoting now. In the eyes of Berlin's NATO allies in Eastern Europe, particularly countries that border Russia, Germany, the economic and political power center of Europe, isn't doing nearly enough. And the longer it delays, the more it risks a long-term diplomatic fracture with those allies in the East. So step it up. Step it up, you people. We need more war. So the NATO deep state doesn't want peace, as evidenced by what happened yesterday. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said once again that Russia is ready for peace talks, but that Washington is not interested in peace talks, and basically dismisses the U.S.'s position, or the Russian position, as posturing. Even the Washington Post this morning reporting that Ukraine cannot win this war, but that Washington is hesitant to push for peace. This is the Washington Post. Privately, U.S. officials say neither Russia nor Ukraine is capable of winning the war outright, but they have ruled out the idea of pushing or even nudging Ukraine to the negotiating table. They say they do not know what the end of the war looks like or how it might end or when, insisting that's up to Kiev. So, okay, you don't have any idea and they can't win?
I think they do. I think that's why it was so shocking to see Colonel McGregor last night on our own show, just spelling out what he thinks most people know and what most people suspect who have any kind of military eye for conflict. They must know. But that's why it feels so shocking for us to hear it, because the news is telling us something completely different, what the Pentagon wants us to hear.
Yeah, absolutely true. So Jake Tapper.
So I think.
Go ahead, Philip.
I'm sorry, if I could just chime in real quick. I think it's evident that the reason there's no peace talks is because if you have peace talks, then Russia can do what we don't want them to do, which would be ask for peace. And since we don't want that, we can't have the talks because that gives them the opportunity. And so it's easier from the United States' angle to just say, well, they would never go for peace talks. And then they don't have to prove it. It's like the Schrodinger's cat.
Yeah.
Is essentially.
Yeah, that's exactly the case.
My best friend, I would negotiate with him and talk about our differences, but he has a bunch of tattoos. He's not going to, he's not a sensitive guy. He's not going to talk about feelings. So I'm just not going to talk about it.
Right. Yeah. And then we can make that judgment about it. Jake Tapper asked President Biden last night about this question and said, hey, would you meet Putin if he asked him to at the G20? Would you meet with him? Here's what he had to say. Watch.
Would you be willing to meet with him at the G20?
Look, I have no intention of meeting with him, but for example, if he came to me at the G20 and said, I want to talk about the release of Griner, I'd meet with him. I mean, it would depend, but I can't imagine. Look, we've taken a position. I just did a G7 meeting this morning. The idea, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. So I'm not about to, nor is anyone else prepared to negotiate with Russia about them staying in Ukraine, keeping any part of Ukraine, et cetera. So it would depend on specifically what he wanted to talk about. But look, he's acted brutally. He's acted brutally. I think he's committed war crimes. So I don't see any rationale to meet with him now.
Okay.
He said that with a straight face.
I don't see any rationale. So think, even that in that last sentence, He thinks that he committed war crimes. Therefore, I don't see any rationale to meet with him. Here's a rationale. If that's true, and it's arguably not, by all evidence, it's not. Reportedly, it's not. But even if it were, wouldn't that be rationale enough to meet with someone to stop the ongoing war crimes if that were the case?
Yeah, how about preventing future war crimes? You were elected as the president of the United States.
Right.
And that country sees itself as an international savior. So how about we don't want that?
Right. We are the force for good in the world, as we hear from the Americans all the time, right? That's what we do. We shove our democratic boot up your ass. So we're going to do that. So here's an opportunity. If you think that this person is committing war crimes, then talk with them and end it. But, they're not going to do that, because if we want to start scrutinizing war criminals, the person
But it's interesting, this Brittany Griner piece, because he wants that as a win. He wants that as like a Trump, sort of like, who can I rescue here? He needs that savior moment.
How Trump? What do you mean?
Like Trump would in I don't know if I really want to make that analogy, but when Kanye West came to the White House and asked Trump to pardon, I can't remember the name of that person, and that looked like a big win, right? So I think that that's what Biden wants, are those kind of popularity moves around Brittany Griner. So he was like, well, I won't talk about killing a bunch of people and preventing continued war. But Brittany Griner, one person, I can have that, and that would be really good ahead of the midterm elections. If I can bring her home, that would be good for me. You know what I'm saying?
I won't talk about 8 years of genocide in Donbass and people being killed, thousands of people being killed. But if it has to do with a woman's basketball star,
that would put me in a savior role, is what I'm saying.
Then I'll talk about it. So Caitlin Johnstone says this proxy war has no exit strategy, and it's all by design, kind of what we were talking about earlier in the show, right? This is all part of the plan. Like, you wonder why there's no exit ramp. It's because it's all part of the plan. Just listen to how State Department pencil neck Ned Price spins away from the question of peace talks in the press conference yesterday. Watch this.
What did you make of Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov's comments about that Moscow is open to talks with the West on Ukraine, but is yet to receive any serious proposal to negotiate? What do you make of that? What do you make of the timing?
Well, you went where I was going. I think the timing is notable. And the timing is notable because this statement came within hours of a barrage of Russian missiles that targeted the capital city in Ukraine, that targeted other Ukrainian towns and cities, and that, as I said at the top of this briefing, struck playgrounds and schools and apartment buildings, roads, bridges, heating infrastructure. We
keep coming back to the playgrounds thing because, you know, we love, they love drumming up that evidence about the playgrounds where it was adjacent to a playground, and the evidence is pointing to, reportedly, is from Ukrainian air defense systems that failed and fell into those areas. So it had nothing to do with the actual strikes from Russia. But whatever, you can keep pushing the playground thing if you want. But he says, I think it's interesting that it comes right after a barrage of attacks. Yeah. So now talk about peace because you want more of this. So no, like it should come after a relative period of quiet because you guys for months now have not done that. And instead, you've continued to send billions of dollars to this region to ramp up an endless proxy war where thousands of people are going to die. This is the ultimate time to have this conversation, is it not, Pencil Neck?
You assess those comments. You have to take that context into account. And I think when you do take that context into account, it tells you everything you need to know about the Russian position and the Russian posturing. We see this as posturing. We do not see this as a constructive, legitimate offer to engage in the dialogue and diplomacy that is absolutely necessary.
Oh, so I see, sort of like what you guys just did by attacking a bridge and killing civilians. So you mean that standard that you're talking about? Like that's the standard by which we should lead? Well,
right. An appropriate follow-up question is, okay, what do you want to see then? You want to see a ceasefire. You want to see, right? Give us something to look for.
Right.
So that we can all say, well, when, right?
Yeah, but they won't. And he's asked further. I won't play more of it because it goes on. But like, what is the exit strategy? And there's no exit strategy. Can't come up with an exit strategy. We don't know what the exit strategy is. The exit strategy is continued funding of an endless proxy war. And we're not going to talk to Putin. We're not going to talk to the Russian counterparts. We're not going to have any dialogue with them whatsoever. That's it. That's our exit ramp at this point. Responsible statecraft, and talk about insanity, right? So responsible statescrafts, Harry Kazianis wrote a fascinating article. I'd encourage all of you to go read it. It's worth your time. It's called "Talking is Not Appeasement," right? This idea of talking is somehow a bad move. You're freaking idiots. And he says it is avoiding nuclear Armageddon is what talking is. And he says, quote, "I have fought more than 30 combat simulations in war games under my own direction for a private defense contract over the last several months, looking at various aspects of the Russia-Ukraine war. And one thing is clear," Harry says, "the chances of a nuclear war increase significantly every day that passes."
Okay, I feel that.
Don't you? And we all should, right? As living, breathing organisms, like we should all feel this and call these people. So today, one of our viewers sent me this afternoon. She was in Prague on a trip, and she said, "I want to send you these photos." All sorts of protests unfolding.
Yeah.
And thank you for sending those to me. So people taking to the streets, demanding an end to this war, demanding an end of NATO, demanding an end of participation in NATO. You might not see it in the mainstream media, but people are taking to the streets and demanding change in this, which is encouraging.
Yes.
So in the middle of all of this, of course, are the civilians, right? And who are killed and being killed. But the West always sees the deaths of civilians as worth it. And just as a reminder, here is Secretary of State Madeleine Albright when asked about this, when asked that there are estimates of 500,000 children being killed at the hands of NATO forces and NATO weapons. Was it worth it? She's asked. Watch.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. That's more children than died in Hiroshima. And is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
So the price is always worth it.
I wonder, how is that calculation made? A child's life is worth what? I don't think it's worth
increased, because it's always done under the auspices of increasing democracy around the world or increasing our imperial power around the world. But it's done under we're bringing good and stability to the world, just like we're about to try to do in Haiti, right? Which we've been covering here on the show, and we'll have more on that tomorrow. So now America is going to start to invade Haiti. Then it's already begun this afternoon. So there we go.
Remember the motto the tagline for the United States Army is a global force for good, right?
Yeah. So
we're doing good all over the world.
And Madeleine Albright, who recently passed away, she was called the I love the nickname. Literally, the nickname that Douglas Brinkley, the historian, gave to her was the Hammer of Democracy. That was her nickname, the Hammer of Democracy. So you've got to hammer it in.